Steve Entin is our first presenter. Steve has authored a paper specifically for this event. Many of you know him. Many of us have watched him and his work for a long time. Steve is the president of the Institute for the Research on the Economics of Taxation, known by many of us as IRET. Steve was one of the core consultants on the Kemp Commission on National Financial Growth. Steve is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Economic Policy from the Treasury during the Reagan years. And prior to that, he was economist for the Joint Economic Committee right up here in Congress. And Steve is going to be speaking to us on the subject of estate taxes, deficits, and budget implications. Steve Entin.
Thank you, Dick. It's fun to be back here on the Hill. There aren't many taxes that are so damaging to the economy that they actually end up losing revenue. The estate tax is one of them. And doing something that harms the economy and gets you no revenue is really rather crazy. And this is something we need to focus on and try and correct as soon as possible. Over the summer, Congress established a super committee, the Select Joint Committee on Deficit Reduction, to recommend a minimum $1.2 trillion deficit reduction plan. The committee is supposed to present recommendations by November 23rd, and pressure is already mounting for the committee to increase the estate tax as a means to cut the deficit. It won't work. The paper tries to explain how and why lower estate taxes actually raise more money than higher estate taxes, and would do more to reduce the deficit than would raising the tax. The estate tax is one of the worst policies the super committee could adopt as a means of deficit reduction, that is, by increasing it. Unfortunately, efforts to eliminate or reduce the estate tax are being held back by incomplete revenue estimates. Federal revenue estimators, both here in the Congress and at the Treasury, show the tax as contributing revenue to the Treasury, and they report that reducing or eliminating the tax would cost revenue and raise the deficit. But they get this results by assuming the tax has no effect on the economy, no effect on people's behavior other than the usual avoidance methods that they try to take into account. In fact, the estate tax is a tax on capital formation, and when you tax something, you get less of it, and when you get less capital, you get less productivity, fewer jobs, and jobs at lower wages. So all the rest of the tax base is eroded, and all the revenues from all the other taxes are depressed by the reduction in the capital formation. We estimated that repeal of the estate tax, and without replacing it with the end of step-up and a capital gains tax as a substitute, would increase the level of GDP by about 2.25% by 2021. That'd be somewhere between $500 and $600 billion, depending on what happens to inflation between now and then. That's compared to where it would be going under current law. Over the period, the cumulative gain in GDP, adding up all the improvements over the years, would be roughly $3 trillion. And instead of increasing the federal deficit by 6.5% over the period, it would reduce it by more than 5%. If we were to compare this with the $1.2 trillion that the supercommittee is trying to come up with, repeal would cover about 30% of that revenue that they seek to find if they would count the gains from growth that would happen if you got rid of the tax. A little history. Congress significantly altered the unified estate and gift tax. In 2001, the rates were gradually reduced. By 2009, the top rate was 45%, down from 55%. And the credit effectively exempted up to $3.5 million in lifetime gifts and bequests, up from $1 million. The estate tax portion of the tax expired for 1 year in 2010. But then it came back at the end of that sunset period, and Congress temporarily extended the tax at a 35% rate with a $5 million exemption instead of letting it go back up to where it would have been, which would have been a 55% rate, and the $1 million exemption under old law. But unless further action is taken, we are going back to that old law level in 2013. And that's the assumption in the baseline for the revenues that the Congressional Budget Office works with. So we measured against that and asked what would happen if we did a number of things to hold down or eliminate the tax. Now, as I mentioned, transfer taxes are taxes on saving and capital formation. They reduce the size of the capital stock, they reduce employment, they reduce productivity, and they reduce wages, and that is where the damage to the revenues comes from. There are other effects, of course. People do tend to give a lot more money away if they're facing these death tax thresholds, and as people give money to their children or to others earlier in their lives, the younger people are generally in lower tax brackets than the parents, and so all the time that they're earning interest and dividends on the transfers, the Treasury is getting less revenue as you go along. B. Douglas Burnham of Stanford estimated that that alone was enough to make the estate tax a revenue loser. We haven't counted that part of it. All we've done is look at the tax on capital and its effect on the growth rate. We took a look at several cases. One in the first column on the left there you can see is the permanent elimination of the estate tax, but the retention of the gift tax. The second one was a larger reduction, a top rate of 15%, akin to the current capital gains tax rate, with a credit offsetting up to $5 million in assets. The third column is the 35% credit, the 35% top rate with a credit offsetting $5 million, which is what we have for the next 2 years. And the fourth is a return to the 2009 levels of 45% at the top rate and a credit offsetting $3.5 million. The biggest gain in GDP comes from getting rid of the tax entirely, and the closer you can get to complete repeal, the better you are with the gross domestic product. Now that's what's benefiting the general public. You're worried about the deficit here, but think about your constituents. Their incomes go up the most if you get rid of the tax. And as you try and grab some money back from the tax, the GDP is hit more and more and more compared to total repeal. What we did in this paper that we did not do in earlier papers was try to stretch out the projected growth in the capital stock and the employment and the revenues over time during the 10-year window. We had just leaped to the 10-year result, the ultimate result in comparative statics in earlier studies. But here we've tried to show what would happen as the capital stock grew over time. And we have the government more or less breaking even by 2013 or 2014, and then the gains build further after. So you have a couple of years of a little bit of loss, not much, and then you begin getting the gains through the end of the period. Static scoring would estimate the repeal to increase the budget deficit by about 6.5% of the period. Dynamic scoring, taking the growth into account, would show it reducing the deficit by over 5%. And that is something that the supercommittee should take into account. But again, your constituents would gain between $500 and $600 billion at an annual rate by 2021, and bigger amounts thereafter, if we could get rid of this tax on capital. The various plans have different impacts on the GDP, and I want to emphasize again that's the most important thing we have to look out for, which is the welfare of the public. Getting rid of it gives you about $3 trillion over the period in additional income for the population. The 15% rate would give you about $2.5 trillion in extra income for the people. The 35% rate, about $2 trillion, and the 45% rate, about 1.7 trillion, compared to going back to that top rate of 55% and the $1 million exemption. We are currently somewhere between 12 and 15% below our long-term trend rate of growth of output in this country. And that is hitting us to the tune of some $500 to $700 billion a year in revenue. The supercommittee is not going to be able to close the deficit if what it does prevents us from getting back to our long-term trend rate of output and potential. They have got to consider what they are doing to the capital formation and wages and productivity. And if they don't, they are setting themselves up an impossible task. It's time we got rid of the static scoring assumption and got back to dynamic scoring, or moved to it, we haven't ever been there, and begin to understand that taxing capital hurts labor. You cannot love the employee and hate the employer. We all start out, generally speaking, with fairly little capital. We work, we save, they tax us on the initial earnings, they tax us on the saving, they tax us on the inside buildup. If we buy shares, they tax the corporation too, then they tax us at the end of life. The whole setup is designed to keep us from growing and reaching our potential. And it's gotten to the point where Congress is now suffering from that as well as the rest of the country because you're having a terrible budget problem and you can't get the revenues to pay for your promises. Don't try to pay for your promises by killing the goose that lays the golden egg. It won't work. Thank you.